Hello, welcome to the third class slash lecture video, whatever you want to call it. So in the last video, we talked about sampling, playing back audio samples, and in this class, I want to talk about synthesis, how to build sounds up from their kind of fundamental parts, or really more how to take very rich, raw sounds and shape them, scrape them, morph them into more musically useful sounds, and how to manipulate these sort of pieces in a musical way. But before we get into any of that, I'm not going to watch these videos in this video, as fun as that might be, but I did want to point to a handful of the videos that we did watch in class. The first is this video. Well, it's a piece of music actually we listened to. The first is a song called Articulation by Georgi Ligeti, and it was written in, I think, 58, while Ligeti is fleeing from the Soviet Union and moving west. And the process for writing this piece, there's a graphic score that goes with it, but as far as I know, the graphic score is not actually related to the writing of the piece, or it wasn't used in the writing of the piece. But instead, the way that this piece was written is the composer sat down with some or generated a lot of material from very minimal parts. So chirps, small kind of vowel-like sounds, bursts of noise, all processed and filtered, and then recorded onto magnetic tape. And then he took those pieces of tape, categorized them, cut them up, and rearranged them, and made this, in my opinion, very beautiful minimal piece. And in fact, one of the pieces that first got me interested in computer music and kind of showed me what you could do with computer music. But the reason I present it here is because I think it's a piece made with definitely an economy of pieces, and listening to it and trying to pick apart what you're listening on a moment-to-moment basis when you're listening to it, thinking, okay, what am I hearing right now? Am I hearing tones? Are those tones very pure, almost like sine tones? Are they rich, almost like, as we'll see later, sawtooth or very bright tones? Are they swooping up in pitch? Are they staying steady? Are there multiple tones? Are they short tones, sort of the short bursts of very rapid attacks, or are they long, kind of drawn out sounds? It really is kind of a tour de force of how all these different ways of shaping very simple sounds can sort of come together to build up a piece and build up the language of a piece. So I think it's kind of a masterclass in some of those techniques and really useful to listen to. I wanted to listen also to this other piece by a contemporary composer, Keith Fullerton Whitman, and especially the beginning of this piece seems to be working with a lot of similar material, and to sort of listen to them against each other, compare and contrast across almost 60 years. 50, more like 70 years actually. The way they're using these techniques, I thought was really fun. And the last thing that we listened to in class that's definitely worth checking out is another video by a contemporary composer, SV1. And this video I wanted to show because it's a really cool glimpse into how this composer is using Max to produce a track, to make a piece of music. And in fact, after this class, many of the things that we'll see here, if not most of them, there's a lot of careful decision making and how this interface is constructed, and what a lot of smart decisions too in terms of samples and how the synthesizers used here are constructed. But all the things here are things we've talked about. There are some sequencers here, and there's some use of filters, envelopes, and synthesizers or oscillators being used in synthesis. But this is something that after taking maybe this class and a couple more, it would be a challenge, but you could definitely build something like this. So another piece that's definitely worth listening to. So before we jump into the Max portion, I wanted to start by taking a look at this program called Spear. This is a program that I looked at when I was in college. And what it does is it takes, we talked in a previous class, the last one actually, about taking a sound and how all sounds actually have different frequency components. And we looked in particular at, say, plucking a guitar string or hitting a piano string, and how that string could actually vibrate in a lot of different ways. And each one of those different modes of vibration gave rise to a different component of the sound. And we looked at a spectrogram representation in Audacity and saw kind of what harmonic sounds look like versus inharmonic sounds, etc. This program, Sphere, is really cool. It will take a sound in and then analyze it and let you play it back.
Hello.
Each of these lines represents one. In this case, it's doing a sinusoid decomposition of the sound. So it's taking the sound and breaking it down into constituent single oscillators, oscillating at a single frequency, and then lets you actually manipulate those. And you can do a lot of really interesting stuff. So one of the things you can do is you just get these sort of drawing tools. And so we can actually take the sound and, well, I'll show you what we can do. First, we could just take all of the sound, all the parts of the sound above the fundamental. So literally just select the whole thing, delete it, and then listen to just the fundamental of that recording. And that low pitch, that is the bass of the sound, right? Like that is the pitch that you hear when you hear this sound. What we can do that's kind of cool, I think, though, is start from just the very, from that fundamental, and then gradually rebuild this sound component by component until we get the full thing. And I'll let you listen to what that sounds like. And you can hear each partial coming in over the course of the sound. And at first it sounds like, notes getting added, and then gradually it blends into one whole. I just think it's really cool that all those sounds are in there. Sphere is fun. It lets you play with kind of the harmonics too. So I could say like I could grab the harmonics of the first harmonic and then make a sound that's much thinner than the original. It almost sounds like a square wave or some kind of wind instrument. It has this weird, hollow, boxy sound to it. You could also take the, let me see, you could take the third fundamental, or the third harmonic, say. Actually, I'm confusing myself with whether these are harmonics or partials. I tend to use them interchangeably, but there is a difference in meaning. I'm taking what I'm going to call the third harmonic here. Select all the harmonics of that harmonic, and then invert the selection. Let me see, File, invert selection, and listen to just those harmonics. It's this like almost toy kind of sound. But again, those frequencies are all in there. They just blur together to give you the impression of sort of one sound object. So I think it's, Sphere, it's a cool tool to kind of play around with constructing and deconstructing these sounds, and thinking about sounds and their decomposition into frequency components is a useful thing to have in mind when we start to talk about synthesis. So let's shift gears now and get into synthesis. So in Max, there are a handful of objects. Well, I'll start just by saying first that, actually, let me save this to start. New folder, in class, OTI, P01CO3. So in Max, there are, no, not in Max. In general, when it comes to synthesis, there's more or less 3 pieces to every synthesis technique, every synthesizer. There's a lot of complexity, but on some level, they're all doing 3 things. One, there's some sound source that is generating sound. That could be an oscillator, it could be a wavetable, but there's something that's generating, usually in the context of subtractive synthesis, a very rich sound. And then there is another component of the synthesizer, which is the filter. And that filtering doesn't have to be a literal filter. There's a few different kind of things it could be, but in general, something that lets you put some kind of shape onto that sound to control either its timbre, the relationship of its harmonics and its partials, or maybe its loudness, its amplitude envelope. And then finally, there is the modulation. The envelopes themselves, the thing that lets you control the parameters of the oscillator and the parameters of the filter. And this is, the model, you could think of this as being very much modeled on the way the human voice works, the way instruments work. There's something that vibrates, a string, your vocal cords, something that shapes it, maybe the position of your tongue, your teeth, your mouth, or the way the instrument is held or the strings are fretted or something. And then finally, there is the articulation, which is the particular control that gives rise to singing or vowel sounds or speech or an instrument being played or any one of these things. So in Max, there's kind of three, I would say, big objects when it comes to synthesis of these kind of fundamental generators, and that's cycle, rect, and saw. The sinusoid oscillator, the rectangle oscillator, the square wave oscillator, and the sawtooth oscillator. And each one of these is, comes from a simple, comes from well, let's first, I guess, just look at these, and then we can talk a bit about where they come from and why they are the way they are. There's two objects that are useful for looking at sounds here. I would say there's scope and live.scope. One of these is designed for Max 4 live.scope, obviously, and the difference between live.scope and scope, and scope. They're both, useful in their own right. So I would use whichever one seems to be giving you a better picture of your sound. That's the one I would use. So if I go cycle 1000, and then I bring a live scope over here, we can take a look at the sound. If I turn on DSP, I'm going to reduce the number of samples in this so we can see, and then turn on the trigger mode. Trigger. Where is the trigger? How do I turn on? It's display mode trigger. Cool. So this is what a sinusoid wave looks like. Here is the same picture of a square wave, and finally the same picture of this sawtooth wave. And these, we can look at the timbre of these sounds too by looking at, by using the spectroscope object to see what the spectrum of these sounds is. So in the case of, so again, the way to read this spectroscope is from left to right, we have increasing frequency. And then from top to bottom, we have the amplitude of that particular frequency. And what this object is essentially measuring is how strongly the sound that's coming in is resonating at each frequency component. And in this case, you can see there's one big peak in the spectroscope at 1000 hertz, which makes sense because the spectroscope is essentially telling us that we could reproduce the sound coming in by having just one big sinusoid at 1000 hertz. And that makes sense because what's coming in is one big sinusoid at 1000 hertz. If we look at the rectangle and sawtooth, we'll see something kind of similar, only, well, I guess not similar. Similar in the sense that it's still a spectrum, but the sawtooth wave actually has every harmonic of this fundamental, the same 1000 hertz fundamental, going up to the highest frequency that the system can represent. And the square wave, interestingly enough, is the same, except all of the even harmonics are removed. So it's the same, but without even, or maybe odd. In any case, it's got only half of the harmonics. And part of the reason we use these waves is because they're very easy to synthesize in the context of an electronic circuit. Hence their prominence in electronic music, analog electronic music, and then going from that into digital electronic music, but also because these are very, very rich sounds. And when we're using, in the technique of subtractive synthesis, these very, very rich sounds are great for shaping, by taking away what's here. They're almost like, the cube of marble all the sounds are in there, and we can make whatever we want just by taking stuff away. Looking closely at these, you might be somewhat surprised by the shape, in particular of this rect wave. I was surprised myself the first time I looked at what a square wave looked like and found that it doesn't even seem that square. There are all these wiggles in the top and bottom of the waveform, and I'm kind of like, okay, what's up with that? I thought I was getting a square wave. And, Max is more than able to synthesize a square wave, a real one that looks like it's actually square. I can go in phasor, which is an object designed to, not for listening to, but to make a ramp from 0 to 1 at audio rate. I could take a phasor and we can look at it, like I said, just a ramp, and convert this into a square wave, something like greater than tilde 0.5, and then scale tilde 0 to 1 to be in the range minus 0.5 to 0.5. And this will give us a square wave that in some sense looks more square, more real, more like an actual square wave than the one that comes out of rect. You might be like, why is that? Well, the reason for this is that, these square waves, or rather the square wave and the sawtooth wave, because these are how to put it, no matter what waveform you have, as long as that waveform is periodic, Fourier theory, we know that these can be synthesized by adding together different sine waves. So each of these, this rectangle wave and the sawtooth wave, can be made by summing together sine waves at different frequencies and with different phases, different offsets. You add together enough of them, and your wave starts to look more and more and more like one of these, so long as you're adding in the right parts. And in fact, this spectroscope, these peaks here are telling you exactly which sinusoids you would need to add together to get one of these. The same is true of these, the phasor and the output of phasor and this very sharp square wave down here. The only problem is this requires frequencies that go up and beyond what the current sampling rate of Max, or whatever program happens to be running. All digital synthesis has a finite sampling rate. That sampling rate can only represent certain frequencies, and so when you try to build something like, you try to construct a waveform or reproduce a waveform like this that has frequencies that are beyond what the system can represent at that sampling rate, then a phenomenon called aliasing occurs. And I can show you what aliasing looks like if we listen to the output of this square wave, or maybe it's better to just look at the output of it first. If I look at the output of these two square waves, they both look kind of similar because they're at 1,000 hertz. But then if I start to deviate from 1,000 hertz, maybe go to 999 hertz, and then start to change it, if you look closely at the spectroscope picture on the bottom, you see all kinds of stuff going on. There are these, it looks like maybe there's multiple patterns of peaks and ridges all sliding past each other. And what's happening is the very, very high frequencies needed to reconstruct this waveform are being reflected back, essentially. And, aliasing, it's a bit like looking at one fence through another fence. And you can imagine all the kind of patterns that you see when one fence is overlaid on top of another fence. There's all these distortions and impressions of different sort of optical illusions happening. And this is essentially what aliasing is doing. And what you're hearing when you listen to, we could listen to it now. Live.gain. If we listen to this, hang on. If we listen to, don't want to make it too loud. Be careful when listening to these because they are just raw, unshaped oscillators and can be very loud and unpleasant. So this is the square wave output. I had to check that it was actually coming out of my earbuds. And this is the aliased square wave output. You can hear these weird sounds in the background. And this kind of grittiness to it. It's not very pleasant to listen to, even more so than it usually is unpleasant to listen to 1,000 hertz square wave. So anyway, all this just to say that there's two important takeaways here. One is that these ridges that you see in this square wave and this sawtooth wave, these little, so looking like almost imperfections, It's not actually imperfections in the waveform. It's that this is a square wave that's been anti-aliased, that has had these extra frequencies taken out so that you don't hear them and they don't cause this. Sorry, you wouldn't hear them anyway. And having them in only causes these aliasing phenomena that make the sound not quite right, overly digital, strange somehow. The other thing to take away from this is that these are the ones for listening to, but these waveforms can actually be really useful for other things, controlling different processes, modulation, etc. But there's a set of waveforms for listening to, and there's a set of waveforms that we use for other things. So anyway, these are the three basic oscillators: sine, or cycle, rect, and saw. On top of these oscillators, once we have this oscillation, the next thing we might want to do is try to filter. And filtering in Max is accomplished. Well, first I'll just take a step back and say that filtering is the process of shaping the spectrum of a sound. Filters actually change both the amplitude and the phase of the individual components of sound. The phase is generally not something we can hear. It does become important when you take the output of a filter and start to mix it with the output of other filters or with the original sound. The phase cancellations that result can have a big impact on the sound. We haven't actually talked about phase cancellation or the phenomenon of phasing. Maybe we should. Maybe it would be useful. I'll just quickly kind of show, if you haven't seen this sort of thing before, that if you have, for example, a 220 hertz sine tone, and easy DAC. We listen to this thing. Got this nice pure sound to it. We could take a sine tone at 221 hertz, and we could listen to that instead. To our human hearing, they sound identical. Something interesting happens when we add them together, and if I make a couple live scopes, you'll see what I mean. So there's one, there's the other. Let's make these a little... maybe let's do this. Yeah, it's fine. And then go to trigger. Cool. Something interesting happens when we add these together and then listen to the output or even look at the output. You'll see that we start to get a pattern in the waveform. And what's happening is these two waves, which are slightly out of phase, we can listen to this too. These two waves, which are slightly out of phase, are interfering, at first constructively and then destructively. They're adding to each other and getting louder and larger, and then eventually when the peaks line up peak to peak, the sound is louder. When the peaks line up trough to trough, then, rather trough to peak, they cancel out, and we hear this sort of, this kind of effect. And this is what I'm talking about, where phase can start to have destructive interference. You can start to get two different, you won't be able to hear the difference until there's, the sounds are added to each other, and then there'll be interference between the components, and you'll get distortion effects like this. Well, not distortion effects, but you'll get effects like this. What did I want to say about this? I guess that's all I wanted to say about this, except that you can hear that they're interfering and they're interfering constructively and destructively at a frequency of about 1 hertz. In fact, exactly 1 hertz. And that's because the difference between the frequencies here is 1 hertz. And in fact, if I make one of these go, as this starts to go faster, 222, the interference pattern changes because as they go further apart in frequency, they interfere constructively and destructively more and more often. So having talked a little bit about that, now we can turn to talking about filters. So what filters do is they enable us to shape the sound, like I said. They alter the amplitude and phase of the frequency components of a sound. And there are a few different filter objects in Max. The basic ones that we'll be using, certainly in this class and maybe even for the whole course, are low res, res and tilde, and biquad tilde. Of these, low res is a low pass filter, resin is a band pass filter, biquad is kind of a workhorse filter that can implement a lot of different filters: low pass, high pass, band pass. Each of these, if I take a noisy source, maybe just some noise, you can see that this has quite a lot of an unshaped sound. It's all frequencies at equal intensity, and you know what noise sounds like. What I can do with this low-res object is controlling both the cutoff frequency and the resonance. I can create a filter. And what that filter will do is change the distribution of, or rather change the amplitude and phase of all these different frequency components. So with a steep filter, if I go to say 5, as I bring the center frequency up, you'll see that where the cutoff point occurs changes. And if we listen to this, we can hear what the effect of filtering has on the sound. So the low-res filter has two parameters. One is the cutoff frequency, and the other is the resonance. Internally, the filter, it adds the current sample together with previous sample values, and the resonance parameter controls kind of how much of that is going on, the tightness of the filter, and how much the filter is resonating at the center frequency. Don't bring this up past 1 or the filter will blow up as it adds. The components at the cutoff frequency will just get louder and louder and louder until the filter blows up. As you bring that point way up, you get a very sharp filter that almost feels like it actually has a pitch maybe at that particular cutoff frequency value. And this is what I think SV1 was using in his video by taking some kind of rich sound sample. We could take something like maybe, I don't know, this rain stick. And then if I just grab a little chunk in here, loop it and play it back. So that's just the rain stick sound. But then if I take something like a low res, and then I do a metro, say 125, and connect this to a counter, and then cell 0, and seed this into a random. Something like this. And use this to set the cutoff frequency of this filter. 9. What you'll see here is, or what you'll hear too. Turn this on. So quiet. Let's try. It's a little hard to hear, actually. Well, if I use a much brighter sound, like maybe just raw noise, you'll definitely hear it. Let's try that. idea is that you could make, you could control the cutoff frequency of this filter using some kind of step sequencer like this, or some kind of repeating pattern, and kind of make musical sound from that, or structure the sound musically from that, like you could see in that SV1 video happening in the top right part of his patch. So Resin works much the same way as low res, except it's a bandpass filter. And let's look at biquad now, which is kind of the go-to workhorse filter. And definitely most of the time you need a filter, you can always reach for biquad. Biquad has this companion object called filter graph that makes it much easier to work with. And the filter graph object, which I always or very often copy paste from the biquad help file, lets us adjust the different parameters of the filter graphically. So if I connect biquad like this and then take a noise input here, we can see what biquad is doing. Sorry about that. We can see what biquad is doing. In a low pass filter configuration, we're just setting the different filter configurations, low pass, band pass, high pass, refer to which part of the signal get through. Low pass passes the low frequencies and lets through the high frequencies. So by bringing the low pass filter down, we're making the sound very dull, cutting out all the brightness up top. You can contrast this with the high pass filter, which does the opposite. By bringing the high-pass filter up, we're cutting out a bunch more low frequencies. We're making the sound very thin and almost kind of like metallic or crinkly, tinsely even. Bandpass filter, on the other hand, lets through just a narrow range of frequencies. This last parameter here, Q, is not the same as the resonance of a resonant filter like low res or resin tilde. As we bring this up, what we see is we get a really, really narrow filter. I'm realizing now I maybe should have used this when I was doing this example over here, but never mind. This Q, which stands for either quality or slope, is essentially the tightness of the filter, how much the frequencies, or how fast the frequencies that are outside of what's called the pass band, how fast those frequencies get cut. So these are kind of the basic filters that will be good enough for us for talking about synthesis in this class. And these are the properties of filters. The cutoff frequency, where the components of the sound start to be affected, how they're affected, whether high frequencies are passed through, low frequencies are passed through, or a narrow band is passed through. There are other configurations too. Peak notch, for example, it's the opposite of a band pass in some sense. I think it is anyway. Yeah. So it lets you like either boost or cut just a narrow range of frequencies. There's oh my lord, sorry about that. But these shelf filters too, and these shelving filters will affect the sound by not cutting a certain range of frequencies, but rather just like setting them to a lower level. You have a lot of options here in terms of setting the shape of the sound. But anyway, the properties are how the center frequency, where the pass band is, the slope of the pass band, and then what happens to frequencies that are outside the pass band, whether they're boost or cut. So these are the properties of filters. The last thing for us to talk about in the context of synthesis is, of course, going to be modulation, and modulation of all these things that we've talked about. So I'm going to get rid of this noise source. I'm going to get rid of this, and we'll stay for now with this biquad filter and this output. So now let's add back into this some kind of sound source. I'm going to take a sawtooth wave. So we'll do like saw 220. And then just by taking this sawtooth and passing it through biquad, let's do like a maybe like a low pass, and we'll give it a nice high Q, so it has a weird sort of lump there, and we'll just move it to like here. And then let's just listen to this. So there's our sawtooth wave filtered with this kind of formant peak here. And now we've got a lot of freedom to start to shape the sound. The easiest and most direct way to shape it is just by multiplying it by some value. I could take the output of the saw and multiply it by just a number. If I make, say, a slider, and then I do slider, let's make it have floating point output and a range of 1. And if I multiply this by this sawtooth, I can, of course, control its amplitude. You may notice if I, let me see actually if I hear it. It's hard to hear because the sound is so bright, but if I make this a cycle, you'll hear this popping whenever I change the amplitude, what this cycle is being multiplied by. This is because if you look at the output, if you take the output of this slider and you upsample it by sending it through a sig tilde object, and then look at the output of this, you will see live.scope, you will see a lot of jagged edges, discontinuities in the signal, especially if I start to click around as opposed to clicking or dragging. And remember that our square wave that had all those harsh edges introduced a lot of roughness and weirdness to the character of the sound. And because those rough edges are discontinuities, they essentially need a lot of frequencies at high amplitudes in order to reproduce that very fast, very sharp change in the amplitude of the sound. This phenomenon is called popping or clicking in the general sense. And specifically in this case, when you move a slider or something like this and hear that crackling as you move this thing continuously, it's called zipper noise. It happens because of this thing we're seeing here where this slider is only being sampled at maybe 100 hertz or 200 hertz at most, whatever the refresh rate of our interface is, but we're trying to use it as if it were an audio signal by multiplying it with an audio signal. So very often in situations like this, you'll see some kind of smoothing. Very common smoothing in Macs is just to see line tilde used for smoothing. Line tilde is like an object that you can tell, you give it a destination and a time to get there, and then it ramps continuously up to there. So if I did like 140, for example, that tells line, well, maybe better would be something like 0, 1000, tells line tilde to, from wherever it is, go to 0 over the course of 1000 milliseconds or 1 second. And if I send it the opposite message, 1000, now it's ramping back up to 1000 over the course of 1 second. Sorry, back up to 1 over the course of a second. So we can use this in combination with this kind of dollar syntax that we've seen before. If I do $140, this is saying now to this line, okay, whatever value I give you, ramp to that value continuously over the course of 40 milliseconds. A short amount of time, but enough to add some kind of smoothing to this. And already, if we use this in place of the zippered noise or the discrete noise we had before, you can hear even when I click around, all of that crackling and discontinuity has gone away. We don't just have to use line tilde for smoothing, though. We could also use it as a kind of envelope. We could use it to create some shape for our sound. So I could send this line tilde a message like, okay, go to 1 over the course of 5 milliseconds, and then gradually go down to 0 over the course of 1000 milliseconds. And this, oh, if I turn the volume up, let's do it with saw, it's a bit more fun. Already starts to have a little bit of the quality of a musical note or something. And if we look at, for example, in Audacity, something like a piano sound. So I'm going to grab the sound of a piano, C74, no, sorry, cute. Studio samples, let's grab a piano sound. If you take a look at this, normalize, apply. you can see that the sound has, in addition to, the actual like fine structure, there's also this overall gross structure that is become very loud right at the beginning and then gradually fade out over time. Lots of percussive sounds will have this sort of character to them. And with an envelope like this, by shaping the amplitude of this saw with this envelope, we can start to give the impression of that kind of sound. And if I take, say, a K slider and connect this to my sawtooth wave, and at the same time, whenever I play a new note, I also trigger this line tilde. Well, I made a simple kind of synthesizer. Of course, so using line tilde like this is cool. Or I don't know if it's cool, but it's okay. You can do it. There are many, or how to put it, there's ways to add even more control than this. If we had to actually go into a message box and enter all these values for line tilde, pretty quickly it would get tedious, and we wouldn't want to use max anymore. So there's a number of objects that make this sort of thing easier. One of which is called, we're not even using the filter. That's embarrassing. Oh, wait, sorry. I got rid of everything. Okay, wait, we'll get to that. So there's a number of objects that make this kind of thing easier. One of them, stupid thing is getting in my way. One of them is called function. Function is kind of like a graphical, it is a graphical way to describe the program that a line tilde will run. So if you lock the patch and click around, you can make some sort of curve. And if you connect the second output of function tilde, which is the line output, and bang on it whenever you want to have that curve come out, one thing that's fun about function is you can make arbitrary and kind of cool, funky shapes. Now, the whole beauty and all the beauty and interest in synthesis, I think, starts to come when you realize that you're not limited to modulating just this one parameter of the sound. You're not limited to just modulating the amplitude of the sound, its overall amplitude envelope. You can use anything to modulate anything. And in this way, create movement and dynamic and interest in the sound that you're hearing. So for example, I could take this same setup, function into line, trigger this when I play a note, and instead of modulating the amplitude, maybe I'll modulate the filter cutoff. So I could take this, and I can't actually connect this directly because this object here is expecting a number, whereas this is just a message number, whereas this is a signal. But in the same way that we had sig tilde, this converts number messages to signal. There is an object called snapshot that converts audio rate signal to messages. And if I connect this like this, you'll see that it's downsampling. It's taking the audio signal here and giving me a stream of messages, in this case, 1 every 10 milliseconds. And I can use this now to control, this is now suitable for controlling the cutoff frequency here. And now we can listen to what happens when we modulate not only the envelope, but also the filter. Except something has happened, and now we don't actually hear anything anymore. It seems like we've killed our filter completely, and maybe Max is broken or something. But if we take a second and kind of look at what's happening and go step by step, we can figure out what went wrong here. So looking at the output of the snapshot here, it looks like we're at 0 as we expect. And then as I hit this button, the value coming out of snapshot is indeed deviating from 0. So the filter, or the envelope rather, is triggering. Unfortunately, it's setting our cutoff frequency to be in the range of 0 to 1. And of course, 0 hertz may as well be 1 hertz. It's way lower than the range of human hearing. And when we say, okay, cut all frequencies at or below 1 hertz, we're essentially saying cut all the frequencies that any person could hear. Obviously, what went wrong here is we didn't scale the values coming out of the snapshot. Using values in the range 0 to 1 was perfectly valid when we were working with the amplitude of the sound, but now that we're working with the frequency, the cutoff frequency of our filter, we need to scale this value differently. And of course, we can just use the best object in all of Max, scale, and do something like scale 0.1 point to pick a range more suitable for frequencies, say 200 to 5,000. And if I take that and put that in between this snapshot and this cutoff frequency thing, now we can actually hear. And of course, the whole fun thing to do here would be to make these into different curves. Or something. And now, you're starting to get into a little bit of sound design, right? Like, how can I shape this sound to do exactly what I want by manipulating all these parameters, all these properties. And of course, you're not even limited to just manipulating the filter cutoff. You could also manipulate, say, the pitch of this sawtooth wave. So what if we take what's coming out here, we use sig to convert it from a number into a signal, and now we could multiply this. So we could make even another one of these line function things. And we could say, okay, I'm going to make even another envelope. And this one I'm going to use to multiply with the pitch that's going into this thing. And just like over here, the scale of 0 to 1 might not be what we want, but I could try, let's try scale. And this time, so over here, I was scaling messages, but now I'm scaling a signal. So I want to do scale 0, 1 to be in the range, say 1 to, I don't know, 2, maybe even 3. Make this signal have a pitch that's 3 times as big. If I connect that here, we're shaping the pitch of the sound as well. And sometimes that can sound pretty cool, especially if you use it, if you really compress the that did not, is that too short? Just want to make sure this is actually, it's not quite what I, even longer. Oh, you know why? Because the amplitude is, okay, now it's all making sense. It's all making sense. I was gonna say if you compress the pitch shifting and you made it so fast that it was almost like part of the attack, it could sound really interesting. But of course, for that portion of the sound, my attack envelope was down. But by compressing the pitch envelope down there, now the pitch shift actually feels like it's part of the attack somehow. So again, you can start to modulate all this different stuff, and in so doing, shape these really complex and specific sounds. I'm going to save this and then create yet another patch here. One thing I want to say is that line tilde is not the only object for making envelopes like this. In fact, there's an object that's much more commonly used in this situation, and that's ADSR tilde. ADSR, this stands for attack, decay, sustain, release. And what ADSR does is it lets you shape an envelope according to those properties. The attack portion of the sound is the part that goes, this is modeled on, say, like a piano. The way a piano works is a really good model for how ADSR models the envelope of a sound. It's a good model for the model. If you think about a piano, when the hammer hits the string, it goes from being silent to resonating. That's the attack portion. Then there's a very fast decrease in the amplitude of the sound. The hammer hitting the string imparts all kinds of frequency content into the string, but most of those frequencies don't last very long. They don't fit with that length and tension of string, and so they provide a bit of character at the beginning of the sound, but those noisy, inharmonic frequencies die off very quickly, and the sound kind of reaches a steady state. That shift from that noisy portion of the attack down to that steady state, that's the decay time. Finally, so long as the note is held down, it continues to resonate. This is the sustain. And then finally, you let go of the piano key, the damper comes down, and the sound fades to silence. That's the release portion. So these four pieces, attack, decay, sustain, release, give a lot of control over the amplitude, the amplitude envelope, or really any envelope in any part of the sound. So I could take, I don't know why I made that connection, but these four pieces, attack, decay, sustain, release, ADSR. If I connect them up, we can play with these a little bit. The one thing with ADSR versus line is that rather than triggering these sounds, we're actually turning them on or off. So I'm going to put a make note here. Remember, make note does the job of generating note off events to go with any note on events that it receives. And I'm just using this, the velocity output here, to control this ADSR. So that now, if, for example, let's just do, that won't work. Let me just quickly do this so we can actually hear it. So I'm just clicking, but this make note is generating the note off that turns off my ADSR. ADSR is like a toggle. It's on off. It's not a button like you fire it and it goes. You turn it off. So when it gets a 1, it goes through the attack decay into the sustain, and then when it gets a 0, it goes from sustain into release. So we can use this ADSR to play with kind of these different values and hear what effect they have. I could have a very short attack, a short decay. These are in milliseconds. The sustain is actually in, it's a percentage. It's how loud is the sustain relative to the highest point of the attack. So 0.2 means it's 20% as loud. And then we could have a nice long release here. So you hear that pop at the beginning. That's the fast attack and decay. And then the that gradual fade out, that's the long release. Of course, you could have a long attack and a very short release. Or you could have a long attack, long decay, and a long release. More like a bowed sound or something. All these things, you can control with the ADSR object. And just like we saw, you could use this to control. Now we're using it to control the amplitude envelope, but of course you could also use it to control pitch, cutoff frequency, many other things with a synthesizer. So having looked at all this and talked a little bit about modulation, we might start to think, okay, well, we're able to do modulation using these envelope generators that make these very standard kind of ADSR or really just AD, like almost triangular looking, or even with function going in and drawing our own waveforms. Still, it's kind of a finite envelope. There's other stuff we could do, though, and of course, we could modulate any of these signals with any other signal. It's all just signals, and so I could take a sawtooth and use it to modulate a cycle. And this is where we get into some interesting territory to do with amplitude and frequency modulation. So if I make a new patch here, And I'm going to call this one, let's just save this as patch 5, say. And what I want to do here is take a cycle object, and maybe call it cycle 220, and let's make a live.gain and an easy DAC. And we can start by just listening to the output of this cycle. So what I could do is I could, in the same way that we were in this other patch, multiplying the output of the oscillator to shape its amplitude. I could multiply not by some kind of steady value and not by some kind of finite envelope, but instead by another signal. I could multiply by another cycle. And when I multiply by another cycle, we hear something very similar to what we heard before when I had two sine waves very close in frequency playing next to each other or being added together. It almost sounds like an interference pattern. As I start to take this cycle up, this modulating cycle up higher and higher in frequency, the speed of that warbling starts to get higher and higher until at some point it no longer really sounds like the original signal is being modulated anymore in terms of its amplitude. It's not getting louder and quieter. It's not a tremolo now. It's blended together somehow into this other kind of sound. And in fact, if we break out our spectroscope and look at the output, and I might have to change some of this so we can see a little bit better. But if I change this around, logarithmic scale, no, linear scale, and start to, I thought maybe this would affect it, but it doesn't seem to be changing anything. As I start to bring this frequency up, you'll sort of see what look like two peaks sliding apart. And if you listen, you can hear it too. You can hear one peak move up while the other moves down. These are called sidebands. And essentially, modulating this one signal with another signal has created two different signals, two different sine waves, neither one of which is present here. Will be one, because this is 220 and this is 60, there's one frequency component down here at 280, 220 plus 60, and another at 160, 220 minus 60. That's these two sidebands, and as you adjust the amplitude of this cycle, they move further and further apart. So this amplitude modulation is actually kind of cool in that you don't have to do it. It doesn't have to be cycle on cycle. You could do saw on cycle. And here, every single here I don't need to do this anymore. You can see more frequency components. But every single one of these components is being modulated up and down. Brings a lot of roughness into the sound and really affects the character of the sound. And in fact, now I'm quite curious if we did something like, I'm really, really curious to do something like ADSR. Like, what if we did something like this? What if we multiplied, okay, let's shape this guy, but let's also say we want another ADSR that's just going to be go up and down, and then we'll have a K slider into M to F. This is for my own curiosity now. I feel like it might be cool to modulate this here, the frequency of this slider, using another envelope. So what if we go from, okay, so I'm going to take this pitch, make notes, 27.1. So, oh, sorry, 1,500,000, and let's, okay, so that will modulate this, and then this, I want to, so I want the frequency of this one to scale from, to be 1.5 to 1. So I want it to go, I want the frequency of this modulator to go from, no, I want it to go from half the frequency of this guy down to 0. And let's see what that sounds like. So I'll multiply, wait, I'll make a sig, make a sig tilde to take this and multiply it with this. And now let's see if this sounds cool. It might not, but let's see if it sounds cool. Wait a second. I don't want to trigger this. Or do I? Scope. That's kind of cool. All right, well, it's doing something, which is kind of interesting, I guess. So this is amplitude modulation. As I said, it creates those two sidebands. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to show you with amplitude modulation is not any of this, although whatever, I'll save this and then we'll make another patch here. But what I wanted to show you is that it doesn't have to be, you don't have to modulate a cycle or a sawtooth. You can also modulate, say, just a piece of audio. So I could grab that hello wave. I could grab audio like this, and we could modulate this.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
So amplitude modulation, as you can hear, it tends to take sounds that have, if there's a harmonic input coming in, sine wave, audio file, the formation of these sidebands tends to make the resulting sound very robotic, or in one way or another, it makes it sound no longer very pure in its pitch. It really changes the timbre of the sound massively. Another technique that's interesting to explore is frequency modulation. So we could take, instead of modulating the amplitude of a sound, we could modulate its frequency. I could say take a sine wave like this and take the amplitude coming, or the frequency coming into it, and multiply that by the output of another waveform. In particular, another sinusoid, and then add these together. So let's make this 200, 100. So let's make this, say, 10, and now, so here's how fast we're modulating the frequency, and here's how far we're modulating the frequency. And with values like this, we're hearing slow vibrato, the sound going up and down in frequency at a relatively slow speed. As I start to bring this value up, suddenly we're hearing all these different frequency components in there. And if I look at the spectroscope, we can in fact see, well, it doesn't look that warm at this resolution, but if I go to something like this, you can see a bunch of sidebands start to flare out. And in fact, if I bring this value up, you'll see we're getting not just one sideband, but many, many sidebands. Rich sounds. This way of controlling frequency modulation synthesis with one frequency here for the carrier, one frequency for the modulator, and another multiply here to scale the modulator's amplitude. This is one way to do it, but very commonly they're configured slightly differently, where we take the frequency of the carrier and make the frequency of the modulator proportional to that, rather than letting it be set sort of independently. And very often too, we'll take the amplitude of the modulator, and instead of just setting that directly, we'll make its amplitude proportional to its frequency. This is a very common setup for frequency modulation, and you'll see why. So if I say give this a signal value of 250, you're hearing that we're getting basically all the same timbres, but really we're changing like the brightness of the sound somehow. That's because by keeping the frequency of the modulator proportional to the carrier, we're not changing the distance between these peaks anymore, just their amplitude. And that means the sound stays constant somehow in its overall timbre. But we can change the brightness now using this other value called I think this is called typically the modulation index, and this the harmonicity or the harmony ratio. And by kind of playing with your values here, you can get really interesting timbres. So unlike amplitude modulation, which doesn't seem to be as easily controllable, frequency modulation really opens itself up to a lot of timbral possibilities. And in fact, FM synthesis, it's hard to overstate the impact that it had on music, in particular pop music and electronic music, and the 70s, 80s, and 90s, especially the 80s. The sound of pop music in that generation, or that decade, I should say, really was influenced by this sound, especially for synthesizers. So, having talked about how to construct a sound having talked about Spear, oscillators, filters, constructing sounds from these oscillators and modulating all these things, that's where I got to in class, and I think where I'll leave it for today with respect to synthesis. But these are sort of the basics. I guess the last thing that I could do is maybe take my keyboard here, my Akai APC Mini, Akai MPK Mini, Akai MPK Mini, and connect it up. Then, yes, please allow my accessory to connect. We could take note in to get, note in to get, this is I lock and double click on note in to bring up all the different possible MIDI inputs. I'll grab the MPK Mini 2, and then I can start just by, well, let's move some of these things around a little bit. I'll make my own FM synthesizer here. So let's move this stuff around. I almost said not stuff, but another word that one must never say. And do an M to F and do something like this. Move this over here, possibly, sort of. We do this like this, and then bring all this down, and bring all this down. And then we'll throw in a multiply tilde to take the output of this. We'll make an ADSR, 0.6200, say, and then 7. take the velocity and use that for our ADSR. And now we should have, if I bring the amplitude up here, a very simple synthesizer. And I could take, I could do CTL in to get some of these knobs maybe. I'm turning one of the knobs on my MIDI controller now. And I could take a cuddle in and use that to control this harmonicity here. So I could do, what's the easiest way to do this? Probably to pack these two values together. And then reverse them, $2, $1. And then do a route 1. And then scale 0, 127 to be maybe 1 or 0 to 20, I guess. I don't know. Connect that to my harmonicity here, or my modulation index, I should say. And now made our very own FM synthesizer. One thing that I want to talk about quickly, I guess, before we close out is that if you did open up Ableton Live, I'm hesitant to do this because I'm worried that I'm going to lose audio again like I did last time, but I'll just check in OBS that this doesn't happen. Yeah, see, I'm seeing the same stuff. Audio is disabled, and now if I come into Live and I go to settings and I change audio to be external headphones, and now if I go back to OBS, okay, it seems like it's still working. We'll see. But if I grab the operator instrument, I think what's kind of cute about this operator instrument is that it really is just an FM synthesizer. And in fact, sort of what we have built here is already, starting to reproduce some of the basic functionality of that synthesizer. Let me zoom the display a little bit. But if, you listen to this operator, let me just draw some notes in here. Remember, that's an A sharp. Okay, so it's just a sine tone. But then if I grab this other one and start to bring its level up, so you listen to that timbre. And then if I come back over here and play an A sharp, 1 octave up, listen to that timbre, and listen to this timbre. I'm not trying to convince you of anything except that the operator instrument here is doing FM synthesis essentially by modulating this oscillator by this oscillator. Now, of course, you can see here from the algorithm, the operator topology, that you could actually stack 4 oscillators like this. So you could modulate a modulator by a modulator by a modulator and make some very complex sounds. Each of these oscillators gets their own envelope, but there's also an overall filter, an LFO, an oscillator that you can apply to many properties of the sound. So in this package here, you have a more sophisticated, more complex version of what we built, but all the pieces are basically the same. You've got 4 oscillators, you've got a bunch of envelopes, along with a filter and one more LFO that can modulate things continuously. But in some sense, it's not much more complicated than that. It's really not it's not very complex, and we can rebuild most of those things in Max. So anyway, there's kind of like an introduction to synthesis. I hope that was interesting. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you or talking to a camera that you will then see for the next online recording. So thanks for watching, and take care. I'll see you next week.